a metamorphosis happens. When somebody has been genuinely abused in a psychopathic relationship, it is like no other experience they've ever had in their life. It's a very, very very different experience. The people coming out of it, it's not like a normal breakup in a relationship. Because of all the gaslighting, the projection, the mirroring, the love bombing, and the abusive loving cycles they're put through, very real physiological changes have happened in their body. Hormones have changed, chemicals in their brains have, and the neuroelectrical pathways have changed. They have changes in their cortisol levels, and many other things, including they don't even know who they are anymore. So when the relationship ends, they may or may not find out about psychopaths or go into a group about sociopaths, and suddenly they will start seeing it everywhere. And right. I know exactly what you mean. Now, that's a stage. That's part of a recovery stage. It's a sort of almost like a hysteria that kicks in. It calms down in 90% of the people. In some, it does not. And these people are not doing anyone any favors except the psychopaths, because they're creating a situation where they're basically going, everyone's a psychopath except me. And I'm not going to name it, but there is one group out there where it's literally ravaged with this. It's mainly full of people who just have decided that rather than deal with a relationship that didn't end for one reason or another, have decided that when you see these people talk on this message board, literally every man or woman they've ever been in a relationship with has been a psychopath. So it's a tiny minority. It's still quite small, but it's something that has to be nipped in the bud. Anyone spreading information about psychopaths has to know that they're involved in a very heavy thing here. It's not a joke. It's not a hobby. We're talking about something very real, and it also comes with a very powerful responsibility. And that responsibility is to make sure that you're not doing it with a broad brush. And it hasn't happened yet, but you're right. I absolutely agree with you. We have to keep constantly a damper on this happening, because the last thing we need is a witch hunt, because even psychopaths deserve their civil rights, and unless they've been officially diagnosed as one, we can only assume in our intuition or in our knowing of them for a long time that they are one. Otherwise, we just assume they're not a psychopath.
Yeah. Well, I think this is all part of the whole picture of the education process. So, good going. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you. It's a good question.
Thank you, Uranus Rising. Up next, we have Odinson.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
I have a question for you. You said in your book and your videos that you think that psychopaths may be superior to empathic humans, sort of the next evolutionary step, indicating that their lack of guilt and empathy makes them a superior breed. Perhaps what is good for the gander is also good for the goose? Let me elaborate. Economy of scale and its nonlinear benefits for specialization are at the core of human cooperation. Without it, there's less reason to trade or interact with other humans for survival reasons. Is it possible that psychopaths are the evolutionary step before empathy, trust, and cooperation dominated humanity? That their selfish nature makes more sense in a primitive, pre-civilization world?
I never said they were superior anywhere in any of my work. Never used the term superior. I said they're possibly an evolutionary offshoot. That's not the same thing as being superior. You can have an evolutionary offshoot that's almost like an experimental genetic aspect, and it may fail or it may succeed, but they're certainly not superior to empathic people. In fact, they're profoundly inferior. There's many reasons to show this. Unless they're in a wealthy family, they're a super wealthy psychopath. Nearly all of them are living on the edge of destruction, and most of them end up failures by middle age. Unless they all their ambitions and all their pathology and all their pernicious agendas and scheming usually always ends in failure by the time they're in their 40s and 50s. Now, unless they're wealthy, and then that's a completely different thing. They have the wealth of the family to take care of them. So I would never use the word superior. That's something psychopaths themselves project on. They try to make out that they're the next step in some kind of Darwinian evolution, that they're replacing us in the same way, we had Homo erectus and Neanderthal man before us. Now, in terms of, I absolutely do believe they're an evolutionary tangent, and nature's not making a mistake with that many, that number of them. So something is going on there. Now, I personally believe that this evolutionary tangent, which is the psychopath, has been thrown off for a lot very similar to what you just implied then, to make the rest of us almost more empathic. Now, in a previous society, would have been, the idea of being less empathic might have been helpful? Well, there's actually no evidence that people in the past were less empathic. In fact, there's amazing evidence that they were probably as empathic as we were, and maybe even more. There are graves of people who died middle age of polio in places like the Czech Republic that are over 100,000 years old. And these people were handicapped and disabled, and they were buried with kindness and loving care. And there's been lots of graves found all over the world of people who lived long lives with disabilities during the megalithic period, and they were buried with that. So that means with kindness and care, and that means that somebody, the tribe, was looking after them. So this idea we have of the cavemen are bashing each other over the heads with clubs and pulling their wives around by the hair is very much a sort of an NLP that was put into her head by sort of Victorian Darwinists who have this not. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I actually agree with you, and actually I think that they're inferior. Mainly because I think the empaths can do everything that they can, other than be distant and cold and uncaring. But the thing, actually, that's one of the reasons I think that I was thinking that maybe they were actually cavemen, and we evolved from them, rather than them being an offshoot from us.
Yeah, there are a few theories out there like that they're actually, this Neanderthal gene or whatever left over. And something like that doesn't make a lot of sense. I have to say, it could be like some kind of archaic DNA sequence or expression that's in there, that's triggered in them. We don't know for sure because it doesn't seem to be as genetic as they think it is. They often show up in families where there's been no history of pathology. So in the same way, it's almost like a predatory savant, that kind of a thing. I
understand.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So that's a very interesting point. There could be something to that. It's definitely something that I would love to see studied, properly by a university to see if there is some kind of hereditary Neanderthal kind of genetic sequence in there, because that would nail it.
I think a genetic study is totally plausible.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And Uranus Rising has a follow-up question.
Humans have been living in a toxic soup of abuse and mind manipulation for thousands of years. Some say 3,000, some say 5,000 years, through control systems and institutions such as royalty, religion, and politics. There's been a multi-generational trauma perpetuated, trauma upon trauma passed down hereditary lines and through collective memories. Possibly, too, there is collective memories of catastrophic earth changes in the past, adding to our collective traumas. Considering this, is it possible that in response to these traumas and overwhelming suffering, which for some could be too difficult for the mind and body to contain, that in some individuals there has been a chemical or brain adaptation such as psychopathy? Could such an adaptation, the inability to feel emotional pain or empathy, have arisen as such a maladaptive survival mechanism?
It's a tricky one to answer. All I can say is yes, it's been going on since about the time of Babylon. Babylon seems to be ground zero for it. I'm going to be doing a workshop in Manchester on the 4th of February all about this. But yeah, Babylon seems to be ground zero for some reason. I think it's because mainly they had the first major agricultural system there, and therefore the ruling elite class of Babylon had the ability to control people's food supplies, and then from that, well, everything else happens, and all the rituals and everything like advertising, from all our ideas of religion, it all seems to have stemmed from Babylon. And even the same families today, the ruling elite families, seem to be able to trace their lineage right back to there. So yeah, there's something to that. Now, can these wealthy elite families be psychopathic in that sense? I think there's a lot of truth to that. Now, we can't, again, paint a broad brush. I'm sure there's of these wealthy families. There's plenty of them in there that are normal people. This is just the social and economic circumstances in which they were born. But there does seem to be a need to weed out empathy within these bloodlines. About 10 years ago, I worked in Italy. I was in Milan, and I went to visit around the Italian nobles' homes on the weekends off to see the artwork and stuff. And some of the houses from the early Renaissance and late Middle Ages period would have the most appalling artwork in the homes of, peasants having their heads chopped off, plagues, people dying of plagues in the children's bedrooms. Headboards for married couples would be showing scenes for battles, and the battles would be decapitations of prisoners and things like that. So there was definitely, you see those wealthy sort of families definitely do have, and you see it through things like fox hunting and all these other rituals they did. It's embedded into them for some reason that even if they're empathic and born into that, a proto-psychopathic situation is created where essentially they'll be made that way one way or another. So but when you said about the chemical change and stuff like that, I think that's quite possible too. I mean, when you look at for me, the underlying root of everything is human consciousness, right? Which is and the brain comes on top of that, and so does the nervous system. The consciousness needs the brain and the five senses to drive itself around this reality. And if you look at psychopathology and its effect on others, so much of it has to do with neuroplasticity and even things like epigenetics and brain chemistry. So if you have a system within your family, where you can actually encourage non-empathic behavior, it will definitely be done. It'll happen. It's true. If you look at basic training in the military, all that being kept awake, woke up early in the morning, and all that other stuff, that's the same thing. So they would have it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking in terms of, human consciousness and that affecting the body and the brain. So that would make sense.
And again, that began in Babylon. They were the first ones to realize that certain shapes, certain types of art, and certain kinds of rituals affected people's minds, and and it basically switched off. They also discovered that moving from the left brain, moving from the right left brain balance to right over to the left brain also made people easier to control, and from that public education and stuff began.
Yeah. Well, that's quite something. Well,
they've had it stitched up for a long time.
Yes. Now, what are the biggest mistakes or assumptions people generally make concerning sociopath, psychopath modus operandi in day-to-day life?
The assumptions, you mean like stereotypes about them?
Yeah.
The most common one is they're all slashers and serial killers. They're all crazy and bug-eyed, and they're all sadistically violent. Almost none of them are like that. Now they are like that. It can be like that. They're all capable of being like that, but they can't get away with it. The only reason they tamper their pathology is because of legal consequences. So they're psychologically violent. They're manipulative. They're users. They find enablers. They're con artists. They're swindlers. That kind of thing. And so it's a psychological violence. Yeah, that's the most common one. That they're slashers and they're bug-eyed Norman Bates kind of things. And often, and then the next one after that is they're psychopathic leaders. And they'll point to correct ones like Pol Pot, and they'll point to